Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about using fiction to tell the story of the 1800s biological and natural history collections and discoveries with my guest, Ann Parson. She is an author, a science journalist, and a former university professor of science journalism. She specializes in the environment, medicine, and technology. Her newest book is The Birds of Dog, a fiction book based on historical events. Her previous books include The Proteus Effect, Stem Cells and Their Promise for Medicine, which was selected for Library Journal's annual list of best science books, and Decoding Darkness, The Search for the Genetic Causes of Alzheimer's Disease, co-authored with Harvard Medical School neuroscientist Rudolph Tanzi. She is founder of the New Bedford Science Cafe, a monthly meetup between a guest scientist and the public. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Nancy.
I have just finished reading a most delightful, lovely book, a fiction, but it is based on fact. The facts presented were incredible because you talked about the start of natural history museums in the United States. You talked about expeditions down to the South Seas to collect new specimens. You talked about many different aspects of protecting and studying and learning about our animals and plants, including the anti-hunting movement, saving birds. You incorporated many famous people in your book, from John James Audubon, Louis Agassiz, Charles Dickens, and many more. Perhaps you could explain why you created the one fictional character, the person in your book who wrote letters to her cousin, and that Charles Pickering was a real zoologist. In fact, he actually was curator at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., but you had her tell stories of all these different issues.
Yeah. I had fun with this. You probably could tell. I knew I wanted to write something that really got hold of the early sciences, especially in connection with the Boston Society of Natural History. Most of my characters, you're right, are real. Charles Pickering, who's at the receiving end of the letters, was in fact one of the best known and best educated naturalists in the country. He was at that point, he was born in 1805, but the letter writer, Catherine Pickering, his cousin, I make her a curator at the Boston Society of Natural History, and she is writing letters to Charles to tell him he's out at sea on a collecting voyage of everything that he's missing at home, and she tells lots of stories about other naturalists dropping things off and things happening in Boston. Now, I use her. You asked why I use a fictional character that way. I felt she's sort of a bookend for me. I wanted to get to so many different stories that when you write a letter, you jump around, and I was able to use her as a letter writer who kept packing in different stories into her long letters to Charles.
And there are so many stories that I want you to share. I was surprised that she actually sent a few letters on another ship, hoping to encounter Pickering's ship and give him the letters weeks away, because the expedition to the South Seas, where they were trying to prove that Antarctica was actually in existence in 1840, these ships, how they met is a wonder.
She knew of his schedule pretty far ahead. But you're right, and I confirmed this. I had to. Back in those days, that was what they did. She would collect the letters from her family and maybe neighbors too, and make a package and run all the letters down to the wharves to hand it off to a ship that was going vaguely in the direction that her cousin's fleet of ships was finding him on Sandwich Islands a couple of times, because the fleet, which was called the U.S. Exploring Expedition, with Charles aboard, had 6 ships. They went back to the Sandwich Islands quite often, but she kept copies of her letters because she wasn't sure each letter would make it to him.
In fact, your book is named after one of the islands that they went to, and I'd never heard of Dog Island.
Yep, it's sort of fun. It's part of a huge chain of islands called the Disappointments. Don't you love it?
But they aren't a disappointment when it comes to all the natural history.
Right. They're coral islands deep in the South Pacific, and this dot of a little island called Dog Island, which I could have called the book The Birds of Dog Island, but I shortened it to The Birds of Dog. But that island in Pacific was known for all its tame birds and animals. It was thought because guns hadn't been on it. My book, as you know, is very sort of anti-hunting, anti-guns. This island's a symbol of the peace and quiet on an island that hasn't seen guns.
You had throughout the book people like your character, Catherine, opposing using guns to kill the birds, and were concerned about the birds disappearing, to the point where you even mentioned how shooting the passenger pigeon became extinct. And you talked about how very famous scientists like John James Audubon, who painted these beautiful bird pictures, would kill the bird to be able to paint it.
Yes, and we have to remember that there were no field binoculars back then. If you were curious about what a bird looked like, to bring it down, you did have to shoot it. Audubon was known for killing at least 100 birds a day, but my book starts in the early 1800s, extends out to the late 1800s, and ends with the beginning of the Audubon Society, a woman in Boston. But there was, way back in the early 1800s, there was already concern about how many species, birds especially, were being shot. And that passenger pigeon story, for me, it has a lot to do with the building of technologies. So the train was coming into existence in the 1830s. Guns were getting more specific in terms of what they could shoot. And the telegraph could alert hunters to where the pigeons were flying. There's this sort of connection of technologies made it more and more difficult for wildlife, and certainly it's gotten even worse today.
I found it interesting where your focus was the natural history, but you talked about modern technologies, new inventions, photography, the telegraph, including the transatlantic cable. But one invention, because this novel is based on letters, which didn't require postage stamps, you talked about the invention of the postage stamp.
Right. They all happened around the same time. The one Catherine talks about in her letter, I believe, first came out in England, and the United States thought it was a good idea and would soon follow.
Do you find it peculiar that the Audubon Society was created to stop the hunting of birds, but named after Audubon, who killed birds?
All of this has evolved, and we have to understand it's fine to look back, and that's being said today. Some Audubon societies are changing their names, but honestly, it was innocent practice back in those days. People had to eat birds sometimes for food. If you went to the Mediterranean area, their markets were filled with birds for eating. So we look back now, and it just looks like a big slaughter, but back in those days, it made much more sense to kill birds.
Finding out about how the scientific discoveries and collections were created in the 1800s was fascinating. How does that relate to what's going on now in terms of our museums and scientific natural history discoveries?
There was this heyday of natural history, which really began in the early 1800s and lasted for 40 or 50 years, where everybody was going and snatching everything out of nature. People can't do that anymore. Thank God there are regulations in place. Species are dwindling, and there are efforts to save species. So the world, thank heavens, has changed that way.
You do mention many new inventions and bring them in a very interesting way. One of the characters, James Cutting, actually created the aerator, which allowed for the modern aquarium.
Oh, I wish I could have met him. He was an amazing figure, and I bent over backwards to bring him in. He and Catherine, my protagonist, become pretty good friends. It's a small love story. But yeah, he was brilliant, real person, born in New Hampshire, came down to Boston, made an early fortune, turned his mind to inventing, invented an early image method called the ambrotype, made another another fortune, bought a yacht, and started studying marine creatures, and then built the first standalone aquarium in downtown Boston. The story excites me so much. I used to walk up and down as a kid down that street, Bromfield Street, to think that there was the world's first standalone aquarium. He invented a way of getting the salt water transported up from the harbor, and then, as you say, he went on and invented an aerator so he could keep more and more and bigger fish alive in tanks.
But he was very upset when other museums or beginning zoos captured wild animals and kept them in cages in very inhumane conditions.
Yep, I just can't believe the connections I kept running into. In this case, it was P.T. Barnum kept coming to town, and he took control of James Cutting's Aquarial Gardens, as it was called, and was very reckless with animals. But this was all true. This all happened. It's remarkable.
In fact, P.T. Barnum also had a museum in New York, but in his museums, he wanted to make money, and he did not hesitate to have fake specimens and exhibit a mermaid and other kind of creatures that were made up from different animal parts from different animals.
Yes, that mermaid, the Fiji mermaid, another true story I tell quite extensively in my book about a Boston captain who was way over in the ocean next to China, was sold this weird sort of amalgam. He called it maybe the Fiji mermaid. It was the head of a baboon and the rear of a fish, sort of a mermaid-like fish. He brought it back to Boston thinking he could make a fortune, and then somehow P.T. Barnum got hold of it and took it to New York. But other similar amalgams were popping up all over the place. These were the times when no one was really sure of what was real and what was true, of what was false in nature, do you see?
Many of these animals had never been seen before, and before photography, they could only depend on artists drawing them. In fact, on the expedition, you talked about the difficulty of having the artists record some of the corals that changed colors once they were out of the water, and how the scientists and the artists had to work very quickly to document.
Yes, and sort of the irony was when they were out there, it was when Daguerre, they were on their voyage from 1838 to 1842, 4 years. But during that time, Daguerre first announced his daguerreotype system in Paris, which immediately people wanted to be in color. And you're right, they had such a backlog of drawing and hand tinting and painting. They had to bring some of their drawings back with them to be filled in once the voyage was over.
We mentioned some of the museums to attract people, to make money, that created fake specimens.
Yep.
And P.T. Barnum bought into the aquarium museum that James Cutting had been very involved with and really cared about his animals, cared about the specimens being exhibited. And after Barnum came in and brought in animals that were mistreated, he actually quit and let out some of the animals into the wild?
Well, I made that story up. But I just go back and say about all the museums in those days, going back to the 20s, 30s, they were all kind of down the line from what we remember as curiosity shops, curiosity corners, because nature wasn't known well. People slung a lot of things together, real and fake. And the museums of the day were like that. They were filled with a lot of hokum.
You're based in Massachusetts, and the museums that you mentioned in Boston, were they the first? Did New York start the natural history museums? How did they spread around the country? Because I know I certainly enjoy our Los Angeles County Natural History Museum, but that started in the 1900s, and your book was talking about these collections in the 1840s through the 1890s.
Yeah, Philadelphia, I mentioned this in the book, was thought of as the earliest stage for natural artifacts because it had something called the Academy of Natural Sciences, which was established in 1812, and it indeed then became the largest collection of natural artifacts. But the Boston Society of Natural History, which began in 1830, really began became, soon after, the country's leading group of collections. But meanwhile, you had these other museums which had begun also very early in the 1800s, which didn't take on the scientific research bent. You see, they just were collections of this and that and everything, and into those collections, a lot of fake artifacts.
You have so many wonderful stories written in such a lovely, easy-to-read fashion that it's truly a novel, but packed with real history. I want to talk more with Ann Parson when we return in a moment, and the book, The Birds of Dog, an historical novel based on mostly true events.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Ann Parson, who is an author of many scientific books and is a science journalist. We are talking about the most recent book, The Birds of Dog, an historical novel based on mostly true events. And there are so many different true events that it's hard for me to pick which ones to talk about. Let's talk about some of the other famous people that you have brought into your stories, such as Henry Thoreau. He lived in the area.
Yes, and I do all of this. I try to stick to the real time slots. So this book really gets going in the 1830s, and it's just right at the time that he was graduating from Harvard. But he was a member of the Boston Society of Natural History, and he dropped by all the time and would drop off bird nests and snake skins. He did not like killing things. So he was one of the few naturalists who never brought in a dead animal, which is pretty cool. And he was definitely an eccentric. Yes, I have him come in. You know, the person who also was in town twice or three times around this time was Charles Dickens.
And people read his novels, and so he was very famous.
Oh, he was so famous. Women would come with scissors to cut his hair to the performances. But I looked into him, and it turns out that he loved science. And he really was a big advocate for Mary Anning, who was a very early paleontologist in England who was finding these big bones off the south coast and realizing that they were expressions of animals who had disappeared. Extinction being back then was a brand new theory that not everyone went for, but she recognized that it probably happened. But I love that Dickens, so I have him in my novel come and visit the Boston Society of Natural History, and I'm quite sure he must have. He was staying at that wonderful hotel, the Tremont House, right around the corner, so I bet you anything he went there.
Another famous person from Europe who came over and started the Harvard Comparative Zoology Museum was Louis Agassiz.
Yes, he was Europe's most famous scientist right around then. He talked a lot about an ice age that had come down and covered the world with ice. A lot of people didn't believe it, but he gained credibility. He came over to work at Harvard, again, just at the point where my story is starting, and he actually got very involved with James Cutting at Aquarial Gardens. Even though Agassiz had his own museum and his own students, he would come over to Boston frequently to help James with his aquarium.
Let's talk about some of these theories and what was accepted and not, because different naturalists were making discoveries, and the 4-year expedition that you mentioned was to see if Antarctica really existed, because they couldn't get close to it before because of the ice. So there was this discovery of the South Seas. There was a theory called the hollow earth theory.
Don't you love it?
But that was disproven.
But that was one of the reasons for the expedition, even though the hollow earth theory by Captain Sims had been made a few decades before. It called for an exploration of the Southern Ocean. His theory, it seems so recent to me, though, his theory came out, I think, in the 1810s or 20s, was that there were openings at the South Pole and the North Pole. It accounted for why animals went north and got fat, because they went inside the earth and ate.
But what the scientists did discover on the expedition were thousands of new species of plants and animals, and they not only painted them, but they collected them. They were bringing them back, thousands. But I was very saddened to hear that when they got back to the United States, some of these specimens of species were lost. What happened?
Well, one ship ran aground, I believe, at the mouth of the Columbia River, filling out all sorts of things. They tried to send their specimens home, again, via ships they were passing, knowing that a ship was going to Boston or Washington or wherever. But they obviously also kept things on board. And I've forgotten exactly, I do describe it in the book, how much got broken or lost with that one ship. Again, there were 6 vessels. They were lucky that only one went down. When you think they're away for 4 years going around the globe.
But specimens were not just lost when ships were destroyed. You talk about how one of your scientists went to curate his collection, and some assistant in the museum took off all the labels.
Oh, yes. Things were lost. That was actually a Bostonian scientist, conchologist, as in researcher of shell life, was on that same expedition and sent them all his new specimens back to what was beginning to be the beginning of the Smithsonian Institution. And someone just took all the labels off and mixed all the labels up. And meanwhile, the conchologist lost his record, so he didn't know what he was looking at when he got home. That was tragic.
We certainly don't realize what's involved in trying to find out about our natural history. And I was unaware that just the term biology was concocted in 1810.
This was really fascinating to me. We hear that the modern sciences really are 500 years old, but in fact, the real science as a discipline actually started in the early 1800s, and I mean all the sciences. So my book ends up tracking and speaking mostly about the biological sciences, and no sciences were taught really. Scientists didn't get wages until the 1820s and 30s. Biology, yes, was first coined in 1810, but not the word itself, not in wide circulation until much later, the middle of the century. I found that amazing because biological sciences are just hundreds of subdivisions at this point.
There were more generalists back then, and now we have the specialists. You have been writing about science. You've been teaching about science. So what surprised you the most when you did your research? Because you had to go to see old books in libraries, and eventually there was an internet resource that you were able to start researching.
Yes, that was a huge help. First, what surprised me most, I think I've talked about how science is not as old as we think it might be. The resource I found, and I already was going to a lot of Boston libraries, but suddenly the Gale research databases opened up for free use by researchers like me for a month at a time. So it meant that I could go into the 19th century newspaper database and look up all of Boston's old newspapers, and there were scads of them back then, and I could even do a word search. That ended up giving me all the more extra material for the book when I suddenly realized that the stories I was looking up, really, a lot of them had to do with wildlife.
I would like you to talk about some of the women involved, because the high society ladies wore hats with animals on them or feathers, and getting those feathers sometimes meant killing the birds and causing the extinction of those birds. And yet, finally, there was this movement by some of the ladies in Boston to try and get people to stop using feathers on their hats.
It's a wonderful, very true story. The feather market had begun years before, but it just got worse and worse until feathers were adorning everything. Harriet Hemingway lived on Clarendon Street in the Back Bay, and she suddenly started catching on to how many birds were being killed. It started with a certain type of bird down in Florida being killed for its white feathers. And when she gets going with this, she invites as many as maybe up to 100 over for sort of a tea party. They actually started the Audubon Society. It was the first chapter in Boston to try and protect birds. And meanwhile, a lot of their husbands were going out in the woods in the afternoon shooting birds. But they really did something marvelous. It's a wonderful story.
The main figure in your book is a woman writing these letters who got a job cataloging in the Boston Society of Natural History, created the Museum of Natural History. The names changed from then to now.
Yep.
But because she was a woman, they relegated her to just cataloging?
Yeah, and cleaning. I mean, I made her occupation up. In fact, I wondered to myself, she was a volunteer. Would they have accepted her as a volunteer? There were no women members at the Boston Society of Natural History for a long time. They eventually, in the early part of my book, they're allowed to come to lectures and things like that.
Information about the campaign to learn about different plants and animals around the world, to have people enjoy them and preserve them and protect them, was just wonderful because it was light reading the way you did it. And I read so many nonfiction books and it would have been much more tedious. There's a very sweet story that you mention about Trochilus, a chimney swallow?
Yes, I had fun with fiction. A Trochilus was a chimney swallow thought to be by now extinct, but the legend had it that they would crowd into a chimney back in those days, and when they left the chimney, they dropped one of their young down to the people below as a present of sorts. So I end up having Catherine, my protagonist, and Charles play this game where they're trading gifts of nature. It was a great way to fit in even more little stories into the book because Catherine, in her letters, she's constantly sharing a Trochilus, sending Charles a little Trochilus that she's found out about through the newspaper or from a naturalist. I must include, I don't know, 20 or 30, but there was one about a neighbor of the Pickerings in Salem who was out hoeing his garden, turning his garden over early spring, and up comes a turtle that he had inscribed his initials in the back of this turtle 30 years before. Don't you love it? He just overwhelmed seeing this turtle again. It's like seeing an old friend.
Nowadays, we tell people you don't have to go out and hunt with a gun. You don't have to shoot with a gun. You shoot with a camera. But of course,
Right.
Cameras didn't exist back then. So what was the movement to have people stop the hunting of these animals for, quote, pleasure and to just go out and become bird watchers?
Right. I talk about a group, and it really existed. Someone criticized me not long ago and said, oh, there weren't anti-hunting groups back then. Well, there really were. And there was one around Boston, but this fellow really disliked guns, and he took out a group just to observe with spyglasses and just to observe nature. In fact, Charles Pickering's nephew, one of his nephews, was a famous astronomer. Edward Pickering became director of the Harvard Observatory for 40 years, but he did something else, which was he was the founder of the Appalachian Mountain Club, and that was all about going out into nature and walking, not hunting.
I wish we had time for you to tell every single story. We can learn so much and do it in such an enjoyable way. The best that I can advise is for everybody to read The Birds of Dog, an historical novel based on mostly true events. Can you sum it up?
You know, it really is anti-hunting, pro-wildlife. And I think anybody whose heart goes out to wildlife today will recognize also in the book an undercurrent sort of questioning technology. Our technology is there to help improve us, but a lot of times they certainly haven't improved the situation for wildlife.
And it's also about the new field of natural history, collection, discovery, and the creation of museums of natural history.
Yeah, I shove everything in.
You did it so well. How do people contact you, get more information? What's your website?
My website is easy. It's annparson.com, ANNPARSON.com, and there is a Gmail address there. So I love talking about this. I love talking about the beginning of the sciences. I actually give an illustrative talk about that. So anybody wants me to come wherever, I'd love to do that.
I'm so glad you decided to write your first work of fiction, but it's filled with nonfiction.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And your other books certainly provide wonderful information about science and medicine that you specialize in and that you have taught about. I want to thank you so very much for providing these wonderful stories. Thank you for being my guest.
Oh, I've loved every minute of it. Thank you for being a really great reader, too.
You're welcome. I have been speaking with Ann Parson, who is an author and science journalist. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.